When writing a research question, you begin with a topic that is interesting to you. You then research the topic to find out what has already been said about it and what gaps exist. This allows you to find a unique perspective or to ask a question that adds on to the existing conversation. You are providing a new point and one that could be built upon using future research. Once you've drafted a question, you refine it by running it through several tests. One of these you are already familiar with, and that is the PICO. Making sure your research question answers the components of the PICO is one way to assure it is focused and concise. Another way to test a research question is to ask if it is researchable, focused, feasible, specific yet complex, and relevant. Your research question should have all of these aspects. If the answer to any of these inquiries is no, then your research question needs another revision. First, let's talk about whether a question is researchable. Your question must be something that comes from an investigation of primary and secondary sources, not a philosophical question that can never be answered. Focus on having open-ended research questions. Open-ended questions can be answered by applying facts combined with an interpretation of those facts. With open-ended questions, not everyone will arrive at the same answer. Closed-ended questions are simply facts with the same answer. An example of a closed-ended question would be, is it dangerous to drink and drive? We would all arrive at the same answer for that question. An open-ended question on the same topic would be, in what ways do required educational programs impact the number of DUIs? This would lead to different ideas and analytical opportunities. For quantitative projects, it's important that the questions be testable. For all projects, it's important that the question not pose a moral or ethical issue during the data collection. If you have a potential research question, now would be a good time to pause this video and ask yourself if you can research it. If your question has not already been answered many times prior, yet it can be answered via research and/or with a study that you can conduct, then it is researchable. A focused research question will not be too broad or too narrow. It should not be something that would require you to write volumes of books to get an answer, but it should also not be answerable by reading simply an article or two. PICO is a helpful method for focusing a research question as it applies to the who, what, where, and when. Avoid using why when constructing your question, as that may be difficult to answer via research. Substitute how or in what ways. For example, why are ebooks used in classrooms is not really answerable. But if you ask how are ebooks used to promote active learning in the classroom, then that might lead to some results. This would be a good place to pause the video to determine if your question is focused. Ask yourself if the question is so broad that it would require several different types of responses to answer, or if it is so narrow that it would be impossible to find an answer. For feasibility, consider the time frame that would be required to investigate the question. Ask yourself if you will have access available to the data or the location or the population in question. COVID and recent climate issues have caused challenges with access. Going back to your research question, ask yourself if it can be feasibly answered. Do you have access to data? Is there an existing body of literature to support your project? Remember, you should not create a project simply because you have a population available. You should not only have invested interest in answering your question, You should also be providing a unique perspective that can lead to future research. In terms of being specific, pay attention to the wording of the research question. Is the population clear? For example, the population of your project would not be students, as that is very broad. You would narrow that to a specific grade level or a type of student, such as first-generation college students. Ask yourself if your terms are too vague. For example, instead of asking about the effects of adolescents taking Ritalin often, it could be asked if they take it daily. The table on the left side of the slide provides common vague terms that should be avoided. Try to substitute more specific terms by asking yourself how much or how many. And your research question should be complex. The question should not be able to be answered with a simple yes or no. It should also not already have been answered multiple times in prior research. Some researchers are afraid of asking questions that may lead to debate, but debate means that there is complexity. You may want to pause the video here to look at the wording of your question. Are the words too vague? Does the wording lend itself to an answer that is too simple? Relevancy means asking how this question relates to existing research. Is the topic valuable, and does it merit further research? Can it be built upon in the future? You may want to pause the video now and ask yourself whether your research question can provide a foundation for future research. Here are some sample questions that we can practice running through our litmus test and/or our PICO test. Let's look at ways that these questions can continue to be refined. Keep in mind that there are many ways to word questions, so the examples provided are not quote-unquote the right answer. Also remember that research question writing, like all writing, is a process. You may continue to revise the research question throughout your project, and that is okay. Our first question was, how do active duty military mothers and dependent mothers who are married to an active duty military member compare to mothers outside of the military culture? We can certainly refine this statement. We have a focused population, which may actually be a bit wordy in its present state. The researcher may want to focus it even further by looking at only military spouses or only military members, but that would most likely be determined through a literature search. Next, if we ask if the question is researchable, that leads to more questions. What are we comparing and how? We may want to determine that aspect by considering what is feasible and relevant. We would clarify what we want to know about these two groups of mothers. Maybe we're curious if one population suffers from depression or anxiety more than another. We can certainly measure that through a variety of professional scales. And this would be relevant as military issues are pervasive in society. By determining what we want to compare, we make the statement more specific and complex. Our second research question was, for youth, does the teaching of skills lead to job opportunities? PICO can really help to focus this question. We start with P, or population. Youth is very broad, so we want to specify that group. We may be interested in at-risk youth, or adolescents with ADHD, or incarcerated youth. Then we can add a specific intervention and comparison, making the question clearer and providing greater guidance for the methodology. Now the statement is more researchable, focused, feasible, specific and complex, and relevant. Our final research question was, are college freshmen indifferent about instrumental activities of daily living while living in a dormitory? The population is focused, but it could be more focused by looking at a specific population, such as first-generation college students, or looking at some other subcategory, such as a particular type of college. Likewise, there are many instrumental activities of daily living that we could select. We might want to look at one that's really interesting to us. For example, medication adherence. Once the statement is more focused, it becomes more researchable and feasible. The term indifferent is vague and difficult to measure, so we'd want to remove that from our question. And we end up with something that is more focused and specific and certainly relevant. Thank you for watching this video. For further information on refining research questions, please contact the Writing Center at writingcenter@usa.edu.